Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's information session on graduation and students with disabilities during COVID-19. My name is Peg Kinsell, and I'm the Policy Director at SPAN, and I will be facilitating today's session with Diana Autin, Esquire, Executive Co-Director of SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. SPAN Parent Advocacy Network supports families as advocates and partners in improving education, health, and mental health outcomes for infants, toddlers, children, and youth. We help families to know their rights, access resources and information, and navigate systems that serve families across New Jersey. Our staff, including family resource specialists, parent group specialists, community health workers, and others, are available to support families, educators, and health professionals by phone and email during the crisis. I invite you to call our warm line for assistance and support. For today's session, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please be sure to monitor the chat box for additional information and resources that will be posted there. You can also use the chat to request assistance if needed. We also welcome your questions. Please share them in the chat box as well. Although your specific question may not be answered during today's presentation, it will be collected and shared with relevant state agencies, department, and used to inform our future presentations. A link to access the handouts for today's session will be posted in the chat box. This presentation is being recorded and streamed to SPAN's Facebook page. The recording will also be uploaded to the SPAN YouTube page, and the link will be shared on the SPAN website and our other social media platforms. I invite you to subscribe to the YouTube page so that you can receive notifications when this and other videos are uploaded. Check the chat box for the link to subscribe to SPAN's YouTube page.
And actually go to the next slide, please. Because here we have information on how to stay connected with SPAN for the latest information and resources for families, including our phone number, website, Facebook, YouTube channel, Pinterest, and Twitter.
So we hope you and your families are all safe, and we thank you for joining us today to hear the latest information related to COVID. We recognize the challenges that families are facing in these uncertain times, and SPAN is making every effort to bring you relevant and useful information. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for today, SPAN Executive Co-Director Diana Autin, who will be sharing information with us on graduation and students with disabilities and what families need to know about their rights during the pandemic. Welcome, Diana, and thank you for taking the time today from your very busy schedule to join us. How are you today?
I'm great, and I'm happy to be here to talk about this important topic.
See, we have a tip sheet here. You want to take us through those tips or give us tips that you think are relevant to our discussion today?
Certainly. I think this graduation tip sheet for students with disabilities really covers the key considerations that parents and youth and young adults with disabilities have to consider when thinking about graduation during the COVID pandemic. One of the first tips that the tip sheet covers is the fact that whether or not a student with a disability meets the state or local school district graduation requirements for classroom credit is not the sole criteria for students with disabilities to obtain their high school diploma and to graduate. The IEP team has to discuss and develop a transition plan that's part of the IEP. And that transition to adult life plan has to include transition goals and also a summary of performance prior to students receiving their high school diploma. It's important for families, youth, and young adults to know how the New Jersey law defines transition services. Transition services are a set of coordinated activities for a youth with disabilities that is results-oriented. In other words, it's focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the youth with a disability to facilitate their movement from school to post-school activities. And that can include anything from post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing adult education, adult services, independent living, and community and civic participation. That plan also has to be based on the individual youth's needs, taking into account their strengths, preferences, and interests. And it has to include instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and when appropriate, the acquisition of daily living skills and a functional vocational evaluation. One of the most important components of success after high school for students with disabilities is the opportunity to have a variety of jobs while in high school to try to identify the youth's employment skills and needs as well as their interests. And of course, it's been virtually impossible to have that kind of employment opportunities for youth with disabilities during the pandemic. Some of the key facts to be aware of is that the New Jersey Special Education Code defines eligibility for special education as students with disabilities from age 3 through 21. And the student age 21 means that the student reaches 21 before or by June 30th of that school year. So if your child turned 21 on July 1st, then they have not exhausted their educational entitlement because they are not considered to have turned 21 during the previous school year. Another key thing to know is that graduation is a change of placement. And anytime that there is a change of placement for a child, a student, a young person with disabilities, it requires prior written notice. And it's subject to all of the procedural safeguards that parents of students with disabilities have available, like mediation, due process, requests for complaint investigation, and emergent relief. This information is contained in the Parental Rights in Special Education booklet. So if the district wanted to graduate your child this year, did you receive prior written notice about their proposal to have your child graduate? And did that prior written notice include all the information about your rights, what you could do if you disagreed with that decision? While reevaluation is not required for graduation, a summary of performance is required. And that's a written summary of the student's academic achievement and functional performance. And that is something that is required. It also has to include recommendations to assist the student in their post-secondary goals. Did you and your youth or young adult with disabilities receive this summary of performance? Another important thing to note is that the district must facilitate the participation and the connection to adult agencies. Both the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the New Jersey Special Education Code require consultation and linkage to appropriate adult systems of care as part of the transition plan on the IEP. Some of the agencies that might be involved are the Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired, the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services, the Division of Developmental Disabilities, the Division of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and the New Jersey Consortium on Deaf Blindness. It's important to understand that students may apply to the Division of Developmental Disabilities at age 18, but DDD funding does not begin until age 21. Another key fact is that all special education rights transfer to adult students once they reach the age of majority, that is the age of 18. However, an adult student who has reached the age of 18 may request that their parent or any other specified adult be included in their special education decision-making process by putting their request in writing to the Child Study Team case manager. And we actually have a sample letter that we're going to show you a little bit later. The New Jersey Office of Special Education has issued guidance for students on a path to graduate in 2020 who may have missed services critical to achieving their transition goals due to school shutdowns and stay-at-home orders. And we're going to talk about that in more detail a little bit later. Finally, on this tip sheet, we have a sample letter that we're going to talk about a little bit later also to request a meeting to discuss possible compensatory education for missed services. And then we have a variety of ways in which you can seek to resolve disputes that you may have about your child's graduation, including the, as we discussed before, a request for due process, a request for emergent relief, a request for state complaint investigation, as well as mediation. So you can see this one-page front and back graduation tip sheet is really packed full of great information, as well as links and other types of references that can help give you more information about your rights and the rights of your youth and young adult around graduation during COVID. Go to the next slide.
So Diana, I think that's a lot of information and it'll be really helpful for families. But I want to touch back on the information around the Department of Education and how or if they weighed in on the issues around students with disabilities and graduation.
So on June 12th, a little bit later than we would have liked, but still before graduation day, the New Jersey Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, issued a memo to school districts, including charter schools and approved private schools for students with disabilities, on providing additional services for students with disabilities who will graduate or exceed eligibility for special education services. Remember, we spoke about the fact that typically a child with a disability is entitled to special education services from age 3 till the end of the school year in which they turn 21. In this memo, the Department of Education noted this unprecedented time period of school closures, difficulty in providing remote services to students with disabilities, and as we know, particularly the kinds of services that are important for transition. In the memo, the Department of Education said that school districts should consider providing additional services to this group of students who would have received certain types of services during their final school year had it not been for COVID-19. They strongly encouraged IEP teams to meet with this group of students and their parents or guardians to discuss the need for additional IDEA services beyond June 30th, 2020, related to each student's transition goals. In the memo, they also noted what we have discussed previously, which is that graduation of a student with a disability is a change of placement that requires prior written notice to the student's parents or guardians, or the student if they are 18 or over. In addition, they highlight the fact that districts are required prior to graduation to provide the graduating student with a written summary of his or her academic achievement and functional performance, as well as recommendations to help the student achieve their post-secondary goals. They noted that this summary may be very helpful to the IEP team in determining the nature and extent of the additional services that the student may receive after graduation. They pointed out that if the student or their parents disagree with the district's proposal to graduate the student, then they can request mediation or a due process hearing to resolve the disagreement. They indicated that it's not required for a district to conduct a reevaluation for a student with disabilities during their final school year so that the student will have updated information for any necessary post-secondary accommodations or to help them access services offered by the Division on Developmental Disabilities. But they noted that often school districts will provide this final reevaluation and said that one service a school district could consider providing is a reevaluation. Further, the memo notes that students with disabilities between the ages of 3 to 21 are entitled to a free and appropriate public education up until the time the student turns 21, except that if a student turns 21 after June 30th, then they are entitled to that full year of services because that's the school year in which they turn 21. They inform districts that the department believes it does not have the flexibility to extend automatically eligibility for IDEA services beyond June 30th, 2020 for students who reached the age of 21 during the 2019-2020 school year, but noted that districts should consider the need for services due to services missed during the period of school building closure. They encouraged IEP teams to convene virtual or in-person meetings to discuss the services that were not provided to students and to determine the need for additional services. They also note that if districts do provide additional services, meet with families and do provide additional services based upon an agreement reached between the district and the parents or the student, if the student is 18 or over, that might mean that a student or parent would not request compensatory services because they would be receiving the services they felt they needed in order to achieve their IEP and transition goals. Importantly, they highlight the fact that a student graduating or aging out does not by itself preclude a claim for compensatory services to make up for services that were not delivered and may have caused a denial of the student's right to a free, appropriate public education. And they say, I quote, proactive steps on the part of the district to provide additional services can eliminate the need for a future claim for compensatory services. The department in this memo encourages IEP teams to address the students' post-secondary plans when considering the type and frequency of additional services to be offered to students who will graduate or age out. Certainly, they talk about connection to the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, the Division of Developmental Disabilities, etc. They also include a list of other potential services, such as community-based instruction, community participation, job sampling, search and retention skill development, job coaching and training opportunities, pre-college support services, pre-vocational employment support services, travel training or using public transportation, a variety of related services, the development of self-advocacy and social skills, providing structured learning experiences and supplemental instruction, and other transition services to ensure seamless transition to adult life.
We have a question in the Zoom, in the chat box. Would you like to take it now?
Certainly.
My question is regarding homeschooling during this pandemic. If our seniors are homeschooled, are we forfeiting the transition program?
If you have disenrolled your child or are disenrolling your child from the district, then you are no longer entitled to special education services. So if you are going to formally homeschool your child, in other words, you are releasing the district of all responsibility for the education of your student with or without disabilities. If you're talking about the role that many parents had to play in terms of educating their children during this past 6 months because schools and districts were not doing an effective job, that's not homeschooling, that's educating your child at home. And unless you have disenrolled your student, unless you've informed the district and school that you are not going to have your child be enrolled in the district anymore, then your child continues to be eligible for services.
So I think that's a great point. In these confusing times with memos and tip sheets and all kinds of information coming at families, that we're really careful about the language we use and the difference between homeschooling and home instruction. So thank you for that, Diana.
And so, I want to say one more thing about the memo, which I think is really important, and that is that the department, to really underscore their strong recommendations to districts to provide additional services to students who otherwise would have graduated or quote unquote aged out, is the provision in the memo talking about the use of federal funds to cover the cost of additional services. They noted in the memo that districts could submit an amendment to their IDEA grant application for 2019 to 2020 to cover the costs of providing additional services to students with disabilities. That was supposed to have been filed no later than June 30th, which only gave districts a couple of weeks to do it. But they also noted that districts could use their federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act funds to cover the cost of providing these additional services. They also noted that districts could contract with approved clinics or agencies or other appropriate entities to complete evaluations, provide transition services, or other services depending on the individual needs of the student. And so I think that the inclusion of that information really stressed the reality that districts should be looking to provide additional services to students who missed essentially the last half of their school year, that part of their education where their transition to adult life services would be most intensively provided and monitored, and the development of their post-secondary skills would be most likely to occur.
Next slide. So, given all of the information you gave us, if I'm a mom or dad at home and I want to communicate this to my district, but not quite sure what the first step is, do you have a tool for that?
We've got a tool for everything, Peg. And if we don't have it now, if parents tell us they need it, we'll try to develop it as soon as possible and make it as easy as possible to use. We actually have a set of sample letters, and this one is a sample letter to request a meeting about compensatory services with a focus on transition to adult life. This letter is a letter that can be shared with the case manager, by a parent or an adult student, and essentially it contains several different sections. The first part is requesting an IEP meeting to discuss the provision of compensatory education services to make up for the missed special education and related services experienced when schools were closed due to the coronavirus. It's a fill-in-the-blank letter, so parents and adult students can fill in the accurate information for their situation. When did the child stop attending school? And when did they stop receiving education or related services? When did they perhaps start receiving only partial special education or related services? Start dates and end dates. And then there's a handy little chart where the parent or adult student can put in information about the service that was in the IEP, the dates without any service, the dates of partial service and which partial services were delivered, and then the missed services. And SPAN also has, and we didn't print this out, but we also have an online tracking form that parents and adult students can use to track the loss of services or the partial provision of services. The letter also refers to guidance from both the U.S. Department of Education and the New Jersey Department of Education. It includes the fact that the Department of Education has issued guidance indicating that the IEP team must meet to determine whether the lack of special education and related services requires the provision of compensatory education. The U.S. Department of Education's guidance quotes, "Schools must consider the impact of a provider's absence or a child's absence on the child's program and performance and determine how to ensure the continued provision of a free, appropriate public education in order for the child to continue to progress and meet the annual goals in his or her IEP. Whether an interruption in services constitutes a denial of FAPE, free, appropriate public education, is an individual determination that must be made on a case-by-case basis." This guidance from the U.S. Department of Education was reinforced in the questions and answers on providing services to children with disabilities during the coronavirus disease 2019 outbreak from the U.S. Department of Education issued in March 2020. And the citation to the previous and this guidance is included in the letter. Further, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, which covers New Jersey, has indicated that the relief for denial of free appropriate public education is provision of compensatory services for a period equal to the period of deprivation of services. And that case is MC versus Central Region School District, the 1996 case, where the Third Circuit basically said that if a district or school knew or should have known that a student was not receiving all the services in their IEP, then the district is responsible for providing compensatory services starting from the time they knew or should have known that FAPE was not being provided, and that they have to provide the compensatory services for a period equal to the period during which the student was deprived of those services. The letter includes a paragraph about the fact that this past year was to have been your child's or you as an adult student's last year of special education eligibility, but that you did not get the transition to adult life services that were needed and that were on the IEP, and thus did not make the progress needed to prepare to make this critical transition. The sample letter goes on to note that the parent or adult student appreciates the efforts to provide some of the special education and related services if an effort was was provided. But the lack of provision of those services has caused the inability of the student to receive critical transition to adult life instruction and services contained in the IEP. And that this failure actually has likely caused regression in the student's knowledge and skills. And therefore, an IEP meeting is being requested to discuss the compensatory services that the child needs and will receive in the new school year, including extension of their eligibility for special education and related services for an additional time period. And based on what happened with the student, it might be for the period of time that the student did not receive services, or if there was significant regression, the parent or adult student may want to request an additional amount of time. But remember that the Third Circuit Court of Appeals case says that compensatory services must be for the amount of time that the student was deprived of the services, and starting from when the district knew or should have known that the student was not being provided with the services on their IEP. We spoke briefly earlier about the fact that the right to make IEP decisions transfers to a student with disabilities at the age of 18, that's the age of majority. And yet many adult students, whether they're 21 or even in college, as we know, still require support from their parents, whether or not the child has a disability. And so this letter is a sample letter that the adult student can provide, providing consent for the participation of their parent or parents in the special education process. And it's a very simple letter. It essentially says that I'm an adult student and I'm notifying you that I'm providing consent to authorize and request that my parents or other adults be included in all of my special education decisions pertaining to my IEP, including all meetings, phone calls, and correspondence, and also consent for them to advocate verbally and in writing on the student's behalf for their special education needs, and to have access to their educational records, including those protected by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA or HIPAA, as well as any documents specific to complaint investigation, mediation, and due process.
Okay, so we have a couple questions in the Zoom chat, and I'll have to see what's over on Facebook. Let me start with this because it was where we left off on our other question. If I'm not sending my senior back to school because I don't feel that is safe, am I forfeiting his transition? Are schools required to let me continue home instruction due to the pandemic? I'm a little confused because I was under the impression that the meeting was for the upcoming school year and how to navigate the senior year and transition during this pandemic.
Governor Murphy recently issued an order that says that if parents wish to have their children with or without disabilities continue to be educated virtually instead of returning to the school building, that is an option that parents must have. And so you may continue, if you do not feel that your student will benefit from going to in-person instruction, or they have an underlying health condition, or you don't trust that the school or district will ensure that CDC guidelines are followed, you can have your child continue to be educated virtually at home. It's important, again, we have to go back to these terms. So the term homeschooling, you've disenrolled your child from the school, and the school is no longer responsible to provide any educational services, including special education services and related services. Unless you really don't want any services from the district, don't do that. Don't tell the district you're disenrolling your child. The second home term that we can talk about is home instruction. What most students have been receiving over the last several months is not home instruction. If a student had an IP that included them in the general classroom, just the fact that they were being included in teaching while they were at home didn't change their placement from placement in a general ed classroom to home instruction. So if you agree to home instruction, essentially what that means is that you are not expecting or wanting your student to participate in any other types of school activities. For example, the general education classroom with their non-disabled peers. Home instruction is a placement in the special education law and special education code. It's also a kind of instruction if a student is sick. So if a student is sick and because of that they can't go to school, whether or not they have a disability, and for a long period of time, that would mean that they would be getting home instruction. What's been happening over the last number of months is virtual instruction, or online instruction, or remote instruction. It's instruction that has happened while a student has been at home, but it should have contained all of the contents and provisions of the education they would have gotten if they had been in school. So that includes the related services that are on their IEP. As soon as the Board of Education approved virtual related services, then virtual related services should have been being provided if related services were on the IEP. So it's important when you have your IEP meeting, and this is whether you have an IEP meeting to talk about compensatory services for what your student missed over the last 6 months, or if it's to develop your IEP for the coming school year. It's important to put on the IEP the services and placement that your child needs and would benefit from once we return to in-person instruction. Because even if your child is not going to go back to school in person this coming year for a variety of reasons, even if that's your choice as opposed to something that your school or district is offering to all students, you want that IEP to reflect the full array of services and supports and interactions with non-disabled peers that are needed in terms of developing the full range of academic, functional, and social emotional skills. So the IEP you develop now should, if you believe your child should be in a general ed classroom with non-disabled peers, then that's what the IEP should reflect. And then however general education is provided to all students in the coming year, which may include virtual instruction, that's how your child will participate in general education instruction. The comment that I made earlier about Governor Murphy's order that parents have some choice in whether or not their students go back to in-person schooling is for all students, not just students with disabilities. So you may have a range of students who could go back to in-person schooling, but whose parents don't feel comfortable sending them back to in-person schooling. And all of those students should be receiving the same instruction that the students who are receiving in-person instruction receive. So develop that IEP, the services and the placement, as if your child was going to be going back to in-person instruction in the fall, even if at this point you're leaning to having them be educated at home. So not home instruction, not you disenrolling your child, but getting instruction while they're at home. And I hope everybody can understand the difference between those three terms.
I think we can also pretty much guess that with the governor's announcement and new guidance coming from the Department of Education, we'll probably be having one of those sessions on parental choice for virtual instruction in the upcoming weeks. So our next question is there a link to the appeals case?
We can provide the link to the appeals case. We do give the name of it in the request for a meeting to discuss compensatory services. You know, if you haven't read those cases, they're very long and complicated. So we can certainly, if you ask for the link, we can certainly get you the link, but be prepared for a lot of slogging.
Okay, our next question is, my son is 21 and has aged out of school. Will the compensatory services apply for him?
The first thing that you need to do is you need to look to see if all of your procedural safeguards were followed. Did you receive formal notice that the district was preparing to graduate your student and all of your rights to challenge that decision prior to the graduation? Did you receive the summary of performance that is required under the law that summarizes what your child knows and can do and makes recommendations for post-school services and activities? If the answer to those two questions is no, then you can immediately request mediation or complaint investigation or due process hearing to discuss the fact that your rights were violated. You could instead write a letter to your school district in which you state that, basically you use the language from the compensatory education letter, but add the fact that you were not provided with prior written notice of your student's graduation and of your rights if you disagreed with that decision, and you were not provided with the legally required statement of performance, and then go on to request the IEP meeting to discuss the need for compensatory services. I would do that. I would write that letter sooner rather than later because you want to be able to get it resolved prior to school starting again. And you now have the links to the New Jersey Department of Education guidance, as well as the guidance from the US Department of Education that talked about the fact that IEP teams should convene to talk about the need for potential compensatory services, that the need that was caused as a result of not getting services during the pandemic. So, and if you need assistance with understanding what should go into that letter, certainly reach out to SPAN and call us, and one of our family resource specialists can talk with you and help walk you through the process of developing that letter.
Do you want to take a couple more?
Sure.
Okay. Is there any way to get immediate supports for 2020 graduates? They are not included with ESY, and many have not had intakes or part of any day programs. Even if we apply, the districts can take their time, which negatively impacts our young adults with nothing to do. A tough one.
First, I want to say that there are some resources online that have been developed by the U.S. Department of Education's Technical Assistance and Dissemination projects, like the National Transition Technical Assistance Center and some of the other centers that have online resources and activities that that your young adult can participate in. However, at this point, the only thing that you could do to try and get a faster result is to request an emergent relief hearing, but you still have to notify the district that you feel that your child needs compensatory services and that you did not get your prior written notice of graduation or the summary of performance that is required. so that you didn't know that you could stop the graduation if you felt that your child needed compensatory services. So you've got to inform the district, you've got to give them notice, and then you can, the fastest way to get an issue resolved is through a emergent relief hearing. And so that might be the way to go.
Okay, next. What is the role of a transition coordinator when students are mostly virtual?
There are some things that you can't do virtually, but there are a lot of things that you can do virtually with a little bit of creativity and a commitment to making sure that the students' needs are being met and that their transition capacity is being developed. So a transition coordinator, for example, could have during the last 4 months, they could have moved self-advocacy instruction online. They could have engaged with students of transition age with some of the online modules that are available through the National Technical Assistance and Dissemination Centers, including the National Transition TA Center. They could have worked virtually with students on practicing employment interview skills. I mean, really, there's 100 things or more that a transition coordinator could and should have done during this past period. I think many people were not prepared, and because they were not prepared, felt overwhelmed, and because they felt overwhelmed, they didn't really do very much of anything, even though there was a lot that they could have done. I hope that wasn't too harsh.
Thanks. I will add that the Parent Center Hub also has some really robust transition resources as well to kind of navigate. I'm sorry. If I'm in the middle of an independent evaluation now and have no placement for my son, will that be applicable to us? Home instruction until they find the correct school and program. Thank you.
So if your child has not already graduated, or has not, if you already have not been told by the district that they're graduating, that your child has graduated, and if your child hasn't, either didn't turn 21 before June 30th, or you didn't get your proper notice, or they went without services for that significant period of time, and you feel they're not ready. When I would write to the district, what I would say is that I would expect, until this is resolved, I would expect that my child's previous IEP be implemented. And you might have to request mediation or due process or complaint investigation in order to get that kind of stay put pendency placement to apply. But that's how I would state it to the district. I would say that I would expect, since I didn't get these things, then my child hasn't graduated, and therefore I expect the IEP to be maintained until we have the opportunity to have an IEP meeting to discuss, services for the coming school year. Again, getting the IEP to say home instruction means that becomes the pendency placement or the stay put placement. And unless that's what you want the stay put placement to be, I would not, it may be that you ask for the current IEP to be implemented, and what they do is they provide virtual instruction, which is different than home instruction. Home instruction has a specific meaning. It's a placement, which means that your student gets all of their services at home, even if school has reconvened in person.
So we have a question about if a parent opts for the remote learning for their child with special needs, how does that impact their related services? Before you answer, I will say that we also have a YouTube video and related services resources as well on that COVID page that we talked about before. But go ahead, Diana.
Thanks, Peg. Special education and related services is what goes on in IEP. And if your child is getting virtual instruction because you select, you don't feel safe sending your child back to in-person instruction, you don't think that they can manage wearing a mask and maintaining a 6-foot social distancing all day, or they have an underlying health condition, that doesn't mean that all of the IEP services don't still have to be delivered. They just have to be delivered remotely. And we have instruction from the State Board of Education that related services can be delivered remotely. And as Peg said, we have a webinar and resource materials about that. So if you choose your child to be educated at home, educated remotely, even though schools may reopen, then your child's IEP, full IEP, should be implemented, which includes special education and related services.
So I'm gonna finish with 2 more questions, and then again, feel free to contact SPAN through the technical assistance line or other avenues if you want to give us further information. So we have one that I'm going to kind of combine with the other. It says, my son has graduated high school. What should I be doing now?
Well, that partly depends on whether or not you're glad that your student has graduated high school and you feel that they received a free, appropriate public education that prepared them for post-high school life. If you feel that they received the free, appropriate public education that prepared them for post-high school life, then hooray, celebrate! Your child has graduated, and now you're working with them to help identify appropriate, fun, interesting post-high school employment or education, civic participation, community life, etc.
Okay, so this is.
But we say if you don't think that, if your child has graduated and you're not happy, you think it was wrong, then you have to reach out. You have to use that letter, tailor it to your own circumstances, request an IEP meeting to discuss the compensatory services that your child needs in order to complete their free, appropriate public education and transition to high school.
All right, so I have one last question, but it is kind of a multiple part. So let's start with, we have never explored the option of homeschooling for our son because we were told that we would forfeit his placement and services, including the traditional program. Have any of those laws changed during this time? I think you touched on this earlier about if you do homeschooling, you in fact have to disenroll your son or daughter and then risk all those services.
Correct. So that's homeschooling when you're telling the district, we don't want district services, we're just homeschooling our child and we're going to be responsible for all of their educational services. And if you homeschool your child, then you're not eligible for special education services.
So in those, there have been no changes in the regulations or law on New Jersey?
Nope.
Can you speak about the students who just aged out in June and give advice regarding compensatory services? I heard in another attorney-led webinar that parents have 2 years to file for compensatory services. Is that true?
So there's something called a statute of limitations. Good thing I'm a lawyer. So there's something called a statute of limitations, and the statute of limitations tells people how long you have to file for relief if your rights have been violated or if something bad has happened that you want to challenge in different systems. So you want to file, if you're going to file a request for compensatory services, you want to file from 2 years from when you knew or should have known that your child had not received a free appropriate public education. Even doing that though, you need to start off with doing the things we talked about in this webinar, because you have the opportunity to first let the district know that you believe your child needs compensatory services and to request a meeting to discuss that. If you're not if they won't meet with you or if you're not satisfied with the results, then you must request mediation, due process, or request for complaint investigation, because you have to do what's called exhaust your administrative remedies. So IDEA and the state special ed code are administrative codes. It's New Jersey Administrative Code. And so there are administrative remedies, and courts don't want to hear from you if you haven't tried the administrative remedies that are included as part of IDEA and the state special education law. So the things that you can do to get your grievances addressed in special education are request complaint investigation, mediation, due process hearing. Only after you exhaust your administrative remedies is a court going to be interested in hearing from you. So the other thing is, why would you want to wait? If you believe your child needs compensatory services, why would you want to wait 2 years in order to try to get them? Now's the time to try to get them to stop any further regression or to stop any further interruption in their educational services, and request a meeting with the district. If you're not satisfied, try to get it through mediation, due process, or request for state complaint investigation. And if you're not satisfied with the results there, that's when you consider potentially filing in district court for relief. But definitely wouldn't wait 2 years. I mean, right now that your child has not gotten the services that they needed over the last X number of months, unless you're one of the lucky ones whose child did receive that. And how do you know whether or not your child has regressed or has made progress? Certainly, one of the things that summary of progress would have told you if you had gotten it would have been some information on your child's functioning that you could have reviewed to see whether or not there was any improvement or any regression from that information. And if you didn't get that summary of progress, you really are entitled to it. It's critical. It's in there for a reason. It's in there so that you and your adult student have the information that you need to think about the next step in their adult life.
All right. Thank you, Diana. We appreciate the very valuable information you've shared with us today. And we really appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all the folks out there who have joined us today, either on Zoom or on Facebook. The recording of today's session will be posted to our website, YouTube page, and various social media platforms for future viewing. SPAN is here for you. Although our offices are closed and we are available to respond to you via phone, please call us at 1-800-654-7726 if you have any questions or need assistance. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive notifications when videos like this one are posted. Thank you again for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, and have a wonderful day.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.